The fastest way to discover what people really think of you is to give them years to underestimate you. Looking back, that Saturday afternoon felt almost too perfect. The sky was clear. The temperature hovered around 82 degrees. Children ran through sprinklers across the backyard, while country music drifted softly from outdoor speakers. Folding tables overflowed with food. Relatives laughed beneath large patio umbrellas. On the surface, it looked like the kind of family gathering that belonged in a commercial. But appearances have always been deceptive. My name is Grant Sullivan. I was 45 years old that summer, and I was standing beside a refreshment table holding a bottle of water when my wife decided to turn me into the joke of the afternoon. The annual Hayes family reunion was one of those events nobody wanted to miss. Dozens of relatives showed up every year. Cousins, in-laws, former neighbors, co-workers, friends of friends. The guest list seemed to grow larger every summer. Lauren loved these gatherings. She loved attention. She loved being surrounded by people who admired success. More accurately, she loved being surrounded by people she believed were successful. That distinction matters more than most people realize. Across the yard, Lauren stood near the patio, surrounded by a small audience. She was smiling, laughing, telling stories. Every few moments someone nodded or laughed at exactly the right time. Nearby, her father Robert stood beside the grill explaining business strategy to anyone willing to listen. He wore a company polo shirt despite it being a weekend. That alone told you almost everything about him. The Hayes family talked about careers the way sports fans talked about championships. Promotions were celebrated. Titles were admired. Status was currency. Unfortunately, I had never been interested in playing that game. Over the years, that decision had earned me a reputation. Quiet, unambitious, ordinary. Those were some of the kinder descriptions. The less kind versions usually arrived when people assumed I could not hear them. None of it bothered me anymore. At least not the way it once had. Experience teaches you that people often reveal more about themselves than they reveal about you. I took a sip of water and watched a group of children chase each other across the lawn. The sound of their laughter carried through the warm afternoon air. For a moment, everything felt peaceful. Then I noticed Lauren looking directly at me. Her smile changed. Not dramatically, just enough. I had seen that expression before. It usually meant trouble was looking for an audience. "There he is," she announced loudly. Conversations nearby immediately slowed. Several people turned toward me. The mystery man himself. A few relatives laughed. I offered a small polite smile. Nothing more. "You know," Lauren continued, "after all these years, I still cannot get a straight answer about what Grant actually does all day." More laughter followed. Robert grinned from beside the grill. Someone raised a drink. The atmosphere shifted toward entertainment. I happened to be the entertainment. "Maybe he is secretly retired," one cousin joked. "Retired from what?" another replied. More laughter. I stayed quiet. That disappointed them slightly. Crowds enjoy reactions. Without reactions, jokes lose momentum. Lauren stepped closer to a cleaning bucket sitting near the patio. Earlier that morning it had been used to wipe down outdoor furniture. Cloudy water still rested inside. She looked at me, then at the crowd. "Maybe we should help him fit the role everybody already expects." Several people laughed before they even understood what she meant. Then she lifted the bucket and tipped it forward. Cool water splashed across the front of my shirt and jeans. The backyard erupted. Laughter echoed from every direction. A few people covered their mouths. Others doubled over. One person actually applauded. Water dripped from my sleeves onto the grass. I looked down briefly, then back up. Lauren seemed proud of herself. Robert looked amused. Nearly everyone assumed they had just witnessed the most embarrassing moment of my day. The truth was far more interesting. Because while they were laughing, I remembered the email that had arrived at exactly 6:14 that morning. 7 simple words. "Everything is ready. Awaiting your final approval." At the time, the message had made perfect sense. Standing there in wet clothes while dozens of people laughed around me, it suddenly felt even more important. Lauren folded her arms and smiled. "Well?" she asked. I met her eyes and asked the only question that mattered. "Are you absolutely sure you want to do this?" The laughter faded slightly. Not because anyone understood what I meant, because they thought I was finally about to react. What none of them realized was that the most important part of the day had not happened yet. The laughter did not disappear immediately. Moments like that rarely end when the action ends. They linger. They echo. They become entertainment for people who are grateful the spotlight is pointed at someone else. Water continued dripping from my shirt onto the grass, while conversations slowly restarted around me. Some relatives shook their heads with amused smiles. Others returned to their drinks as though nothing unusual had happened. A few avoided looking at me altogether. That was probably the most honest reaction in the entire backyard. Looking away requires at least a small amount of self-awareness. Lauren seemed pleased with herself. She accepted several approving smiles from nearby relatives and casually brushed a strand of hair behind her ear. To everyone watching, she had won another round of a game I never agreed to play. The strange thing was that I did not feel angry. Embarrassed, maybe. Disappointed, certainly. But anger had left this marriage a long time ago. Anger requires energy. Eventually, disappointment becomes quieter, more efficient. I reached for a stack of paper napkins and calmly wiped water from my hands. That seemed to confuse people. They expected a reaction, a complaint, a confrontation, something dramatic. Instead, I gave them nothing. Over the years, I had learned an important lesson. People who are determined to misunderstand you will treat every explanation like evidence against you. Across the yard, Robert was already retelling the story to another group. His gestures grew larger with each version. The bucket became bigger. The joke became funnier. My role became more pathetic. That was his talent. Every story somehow ended with him standing a little taller. I watched him for a moment before taking another sip of water. The cold plastic bottle felt ordinary in my hand. I liked ordinary things. Maybe that was part of the problem. The Hayes family measured success through visibility. Bigger houses, better titles, newer vehicles, louder accomplishments. I had spent most of my adult life moving in the opposite direction. The less attention I received, the more comfortable I became. Unfortunately, people often mistake privacy for failure. Lauren eventually walked toward me carrying a glass of lemonade. Her expression suggested she expected me to say something. "You are awfully quiet," she said. Should I be worried? A few relatives nearby listened carefully. They were hoping for conflict. Backyard gatherings become much more interesting when someone loses control. "No," I said. "You should not be worried." She tilted her head slightly. "Good. For a second, I thought you were finally going to stand up for yourself." Several people laughed. The joke landed exactly the way she intended. I smiled politely. Nothing more. The truth was that I had spent years standing up for myself, just not in ways anyone there understood. Lauren interpreted my silence the same way everyone else did. Weakness, resignation, defeat. It never occurred to her that silence can also be confidence. Nearby, two of her cousins started discussing promotions at Horizon Industries. One had recently moved into a management role. The other hoped to do the same by next year. Conversations about the company appeared everywhere at family events. Horizon was more than an employer to them. It was a source of identity. Robert worked there. Lauren worked there. Her brother worked there. Several cousins worked there. The company connected half the family in one way or another. They spoke about senior executives the way sports fans discussed famous athletes. Every title carried status. Every promotion carried prestige. Listening to them always felt slightly surreal. Not because they were wrong, because they were missing a piece of the picture so large it changed everything. A breeze moved through the backyard, carrying the scent of grilled burgers and freshly cut grass. Children continued running through sprinklers as though nothing important had happened. The afternoon sun reflected off windows overlooking the yard. Everything looked normal. That was the remarkable thing about life. The biggest changes often happen while the scenery remains exactly the same. Lauren glanced at my soaked shirt and shook her head with a small laugh. "Maybe next year we will find you a real career," she said. More laughter followed. I simply nodded. Looking back, that sentence was more important than she realized. Because a few hours earlier, before the reunion even began, I had received an email at exactly 6:14 in the morning. 7 words. "Everything is ready. Awaiting your final approval." At the time, it felt routine. Standing there while the Hayes family laughed around me, it felt like a countdown. And the closer the afternoon moved toward evening, the less time remained before everyone in that backyard learned something they never expected. Most people think secrets are difficult to keep. In my experience, the opposite is true. The easiest secrets to protect are the ones nobody thinks to question. As the reunion continued around me, I stepped away from the center of the crowd and moved toward the edge of the backyard. Not because I was upset, not because I wanted privacy, I simply preferred distance. Distance makes observation easier. From there, I could see everything. Children running through sprinklers. Relatives balancing paper plates loaded with food. Conversations forming and dissolving beneath patio umbrellas. The same summer gathering continued exactly as it had before. Yet every few minutes I found myself thinking about the email that had arrived that morning. 7 words. Everything is ready. Awaiting your final approval. I remembered the moment clearly. It had been 6:14 in the morning. The house was quiet. Lauren was still asleep upstairs. Sunlight had barely begun creeping through the kitchen windows. I sat alone with a cup of coffee when my phone vibrated beside me. The sender was familiar. The subject line was short, efficient, professional. I opened the message, read it once, and smiled. Then I read it again. Not because I was surprised, because after all these years, certain moments still carried weight. I closed the email, finished my coffee, and continued the morning exactly as planned. Nobody noticed anything different. Nobody ever did. Across the lawn, Robert was now explaining company growth statistics to a group of cousins. Horizon Industries seemed to appear in every conversation. Promotions, departments, executives, expansion plans. The company had become part of the family's identity. Listening to them always felt strange. Not because they were wrong about Horizon, because they never understood where the story began. Years earlier, before anyone in that backyard had ever heard the company's name, Horizon existed as little more than an idea in a rented warehouse. The building was small. The roof leaked during heavy rain. The air conditioning worked only when it felt motivated. I spent countless nights there alone. Some weeks I worked 80 hours. Other weeks felt longer. There were no guarantees. No investors waiting to save me. No headlines celebrating progress. Just invoices, uncertainty, and stubborn determination. I remember driving hundreds of miles to meet potential clients who barely remembered my name afterward. I remember eating gas station sandwiches because every dollar mattered. I remember sitting at a folding desk long after midnight, trying to solve problems nobody else could see. Success looks impressive when viewed from a distance. Up close, it usually looks like sacrifice. 1 contract became 3. 3 became 10. 10 became opportunities one never expected. Slowly, almost invisibly, Horizon grew. New facilities opened. Revenue increased. Teams expanded. The company became larger than the original dream. That was the irony nobody understood. I never wanted attention. I wanted freedom. Eventually, the board convinced me to step away from daily operations while retaining ownership and strategic authority. Public visibility passed to executives better suited for it. I preferred it that way. The less people knew, the easier life became. At least that had been the plan. A burst of laughter pulled me back to the present. Lauren was speaking to another group near the patio. I caught my name once. Then more laughter. The details hardly mattered anymore. The pattern had become familiar. What they saw when they looked at me was a man without ambition. A husband drifting through life. Someone content with mediocrity. The truth never crossed their minds because it was too far outside the version of reality they had built. People tend to see exactly what they expect to see. A warm breeze moved through the backyard. Leaves shifted gently in nearby trees. Ice clinked inside plastic cups. Everything felt normal. Looking back, that was probably the most remarkable part. The entire afternoon still looked ordinary. Nobody knew a single conversation, a single email, and a single arrival later that day would change everything they believed. And somewhere beyond the neighborhood entrance, events were already moving into place exactly as planned. By late afternoon, the reunion had settled into a familiar rhythm. The food tables were half empty. The coolers needed refilling. Children had traded running games for ice cream and lemonade. Most people were relaxed enough to stop pretending and start showing who they really were. That was usually my least favorite part of any gathering. Across the backyard, Robert had assembled what looked like an audience. 3 cousins, 2 neighbors, Lauren's brother, and several co-workers stood around him while he spoke with the confidence of a man who believed every sentence deserved an audience. I stayed near the edge of the patio and listened. The company is heading into another major growth phase, Robert announced. Leadership is already talking about expansion. Several people nodded with obvious admiration. One cousin asked if that meant more management positions. Robert smiled immediately. For the right people, opportunities are always available. The answer sounded rehearsed, like something he had repeated dozens of times before. Nearby, Lauren joined the conversation carrying a fresh drink. Dad is being modest, she said. People listen when he speaks. Robert pretended to wave away the compliment, but the smile on his face remained. Experience matters, he replied. That is why certain people move forward while others stay exactly where they are. The comment was not directed at me by name. It did not need to be. Several eyes shifted in my direction before quickly looking away again. I almost laughed. The remarkable thing was how predictable it had become. Every conversation eventually found its way back to status. Titles, influence, visibility, position. The Hayes family treated those things like proof of character, as if success could be measured by the size of an office door. Lauren sat beside one of her co-workers and crossed her legs. Things are changing at Horizon, she said. The people making decisions now are focused on excellence. Another co-worker nodded enthusiastically. The company is becoming more selective. It should be, Lauren replied. Not everyone belongs at the top. More agreement followed. Listening to them felt like watching people discuss a puzzle while missing the largest piece on the table. They were so confident, so certain. That certainty fascinated me. Human beings become most vulnerable when they believe they already understand everything. A few feet away, Lauren's brother Jason joined the conversation. I heard there may be leadership evaluations coming later this year. Several people reacted immediately. Really, someone asked. Jason shrugged. That is what people are saying. Robert folded his arms. Evaluations do not concern me. The statement drew laughter and approving nods. Confidence surrounded him like a custom-tailored jacket. People who perform will have nothing to worry about, he continued. The company rewards value. Value. Interesting word. Everyone uses it. Very few understand it. I watched a paper napkin drift across the lawn in the breeze. Somewhere behind me, ice shifted inside a cooler. The ordinary sounds of summer continued while the conversation grew more arrogant. That is why I respect Horizon, Lawrence said. The company recognizes people who matter. Several co-workers agreed immediately. One even raised a plastic cup in a casual toast. I wondered how they would react if they knew the person standing alone near the patio had spent years helping shape many of the decisions they admired. Not because I wanted recognition, because the contrast was impossible to ignore. Lauren glanced toward me and smiled faintly. Some people never understand ambition, she said. They are comfortable staying exactly where they are. More laughter followed. I remained silent. Not because I lacked an answer, because timing matters. The truth delivered too early becomes an argument. The truth delivered at the right moment becomes undeniable. A warm breeze moved through the trees. The afternoon sun lowered slightly toward the horizon. Long shadows began stretching across the grass. Looking back, that was the moment everything started shifting. Nobody noticed it. Nobody could have. But somewhere beyond the neighborhood entrance, several black vehicles had already turned onto the road leading toward the Hayes property. And while the family continued celebrating their importance, the first pieces of a very different conversation were already moving into place. The strange thing about building something from nothing is that almost nobody believes you did it once the finished version becomes successful. People see the result and invent a different story. They assume there must have been shortcuts, connections, luck, timing, anything except years of sacrifice. As the afternoon continued, I found myself thinking about that while watching the Hayes family celebrate their own importance. The conversations had not changed. If anything, they had become more confident. Robert was still holding court near the grill. Lauren was still surrounded by relatives and co-workers. Every discussion seemed to circle back to Horizon. Promotions, leadership, expansion, influence. The company had become a symbol. What fascinated me was how few people ever asked where symbols come from. Horizon had not started in a boardroom. It had not started with investors. It had started with a leaking warehouse and a folding table. 20 years earlier, I had spent more nights sleeping beside spreadsheets than sleeping in my own bed. I remembered winter mornings when the heating system barely worked and my breath was visible inside the building. I remembered loading equipment myself because hiring help would have emptied the account. I remembered driving through rainstorms to meet clients who never called back. Failure had been a regular visitor in those years. Most people only see success after it becomes obvious. They never see the hundreds of moments when quitting would have been easier. A burst of laughter pulled me back to the present. Lauren was telling a story to a group gathered near the patio. I could not hear every word, but I caught enough. She was describing ambition, the importance of setting standards, the need to surround yourself with successful people. Heads nodded around her. Agreement came easily when everyone already believed the same thing. That is why Horizon keeps growing, she said. Leadership understands excellence. More nods followed. I almost smiled. Excellence. Interesting word. People love using it because it sounds impressive. Few understand what it actually costs. Excellence usually looks boring from the outside. Long hours, difficult decisions, consistency, responsibility. None of those things make exciting stories at family reunions. Nearby, Jason joined the conversation carrying a fresh drink. I heard another acquisition might be happening, he said. Several people reacted immediately. One coworker leaned forward. Really? Jason shrugged. That is what people inside the company are saying. Robert smiled knowingly. Growth attracts opportunity. The statement sounded important enough to earn another round of approval. The irony was almost overwhelming. They were discussing decisions that had already crossed my desk. Decisions connected directly to the email sitting in my inbox. Decisions none of them knew anything about. A warm breeze moved across the backyard, carrying the smell of charcoal and freshly cut grass. The sun had begun lowering toward the horizon. Golden light reflected across windows and parked vehicles. Everything still looked normal. Looking back, that was the final stage of the illusion. The moment right before reality arrives. Lauren glanced toward me again. Grant has probably heard enough business talk for one day, she joked. Not everybody enjoys ambition. Laughter followed immediately. I simply raised my bottle slightly in acknowledgement. The response seemed to disappoint her. She wanted engagement. She wanted a reaction. Instead, she received calm. People often mistake calm for weakness because they cannot imagine strength remaining quiet. My phone vibrated once inside my pocket. The movement was subtle. Nobody else noticed. I slipped the phone out just enough to read the screen. One new message. 3 words. Arriving in 15. I looked at the timestamp. Then I locked the screen and returned the phone to my pocket. 15 minutes. That was all. Across the yard, the conversations continued exactly as before. Robert was still talking. Lauren was still smiling. Relatives were still laughing. The entire family remained completely convinced they understood who I was. And for the first time all afternoon, I realized the countdown was no longer measured in hours. It was measured in minutes. The message remained on my screen for only a few seconds before I locked the phone and slipped it back into my pocket. Arriving in 15. Simple words. Ordinary words. Yet they carried enough weight to change the direction of the entire afternoon. Around me, nothing appeared different. That was the remarkable part. The Hayes family reunion continued exactly as it always had. Music drifted from outdoor speakers. Ice rattled inside coolers. Children chased each other across the lawn while adults balanced paper plates and talked about careers, promotions, and plans for the future. Nobody noticed the countdown had already begun. I leaned against the patio railing and watched the gathering with the detached calm of someone observing a movie he had already seen before. Across the yard, Lauren was speaking with several co-workers from Horizon. Every few moments they laughed together. Robert remained near the grill, still surrounded by relatives who treated his opinions like expert analysis. Jason had joined another group discussing company rumors. The subject seemed familiar. Expansion, leadership changes, growth. The same topics kept circulating through the afternoon like a radio station nobody could turn off. What struck me most was how confident everyone sounded. Confidence is an interesting thing. It feels exactly like certainty right before reality proves otherwise. A cousin I had not spoken to all day finally approached me carrying a soda. "You surviving over here?" he asked with a grin. "I am doing fine," I replied. He glanced toward Lauren. "She can be tough sometimes." I smiled politely. "Sometimes." He laughed awkwardly and shifted his weight. "You know she does not mean anything by it." That sentence always fascinated me. People use it whenever they want to excuse behavior they would never tolerate themselves. I nodded without arguing. There was no point. Explanations rarely improve conversations built on assumptions. He eventually wandered back toward the crowd, leaving me alone again. I preferred it that way. A warm breeze moved through the trees bordering the property. Sunlight reflected off nearby windows. Long shadows stretched farther across the grass. The afternoon was beginning its slow transition toward evening. I checked my watch. 12 minutes. Not long now. Lauren noticed me looking at the time. Got somewhere important to be? She called from across the patio. Several people laughed. I raised my bottle slightly. Not yet. That is probably the most mysterious answer you have given all year. One coworker joked. More laughter followed. Lauren smiled. Grant loves being mysterious. It saves him from having to explain what he actually does. The crowd rewarded the comment exactly as expected. I remained calm. Looking back, her words carried more irony than she could have imagined. Nearby, Robert stepped into the conversation. Some people are content watching life happen, he said. Others make things happen. Several heads nodded immediately. It was the kind of sentence that sounded profound until you thought about it for more than 5 seconds. I almost responded. Almost. Instead, I looked toward the street beyond the property line. Not because I could see anything yet, because I knew what was coming. 10 minutes. Then 9. The reunion continued. Burgers came off the grill. Drinks were refilled. Someone started organizing a group photograph. Life moved forward completely unaware of the turn waiting just ahead. Lauren walked past me carrying another lemonade. You know, she said quietly enough that only I could hear. Sometimes I honestly wonder how you stay so relaxed all the time. I met her eyes. Practice. She laughed and shook her head before walking away. The answer sounded like a joke. It was not. Calm is easier when you are no longer trying to prove yourself. A few moments later, a distant sound reached the property. Faint at first, barely noticeable. The low hum of multiple engines approaching from the main road. Nobody paid attention. Not yet. They were too busy talking. Too busy laughing. Too busy admiring their own reflections in the stories they told each other. But as the sound slowly grew louder, I checked my watch one final time and smiled. Right on schedule. The first person to notice the vehicles was not Robert. It was not Lauren either. It was one of the younger cousins standing near the driveway with a camera in his hand. He stopped talking in the middle of a sentence and looked toward the street. A second later, 2 more people followed his gaze. Then another. Then another. Attention spreads quickly when something unusual appears. Within moments, conversations across the backyard began slowing as heads turned in the same direction. I remained exactly where I was. The low hum of engines grew louder. Beyond the line of trees bordering the property, dark shapes became visible through gaps in the leaves. One black SUV appeared first, then a second, then a third. They moved slowly down the long residential road with the deliberate confidence of vehicles carrying important passengers. Almost immediately, excitement began spreading through the gathering. "What is that?" someone asked. "Those look corporate," another replied. Near the grill, Robert stopped speaking mid-sentence. His attention shifted entirely toward the approaching convoy. The same thing happened to Lauren. Her expression changed from casual amusement to curiosity. "No way," one coworker whispered. "Those are executive vehicles." Suddenly nobody cared about burgers, lemonade, or family stories anymore. Every conversation pointed toward the road. The entire atmosphere changed. Human beings are remarkably predictable around status. The possibility of proximity to power creates excitement faster than almost anything else. Lauren walked closer to the edge of the patio. "Do you think someone from Horizon is coming?" she asked. One coworker nodded immediately. "Maybe regional leadership." Another shook his head. "That level of security looks bigger than regional leadership." Robert straightened his posture and adjusted the collar of his polo shirt. I noticed several others doing the same thing. Shirts were smoothed. Hair was adjusted. Smiles became more professional. It was amazing how quickly people transformed when they thought someone important might be watching. The vehicles turned into the long driveway leading toward the property. Gravel crunched beneath expensive tires. The engines quieted as they rolled to a controlled stop. Nobody spoke now. Even the children seemed distracted by the sudden arrival. I checked my watch. Perfect timing. Lauren glanced at me briefly before looking back toward the driveway. For the first time all afternoon, I was not the center of attention. Something else had captured the crowd. Several co-workers moved closer together. They began quietly guessing who might be inside the lead vehicle. Names circulated through whispers. Vice presidents, senior directors, board members. Every theory sounded more confident than the last. None of them were correct. Robert laughed nervously. Maybe they heard I was hosting. Several people laughed with him. The joke landed, but not as strongly as he expected. Everyone was too focused on the vehicles. One of the rear passenger doors opened. A professionally dressed man stepped out first. Then another. then a woman carrying a portfolio. The crowd immediately recognized the look. Corporate, executive, important. More doors opened. Additional personnel emerged. The gathering had become completely silent now. Finally, the rear door of the lead SUV opened. Daniel Mercer stepped out. The reaction was immediate. Several employees inhaled sharply. One coworker actually whispered his name aloud. Daniel Mercer was not just another executive. He was the public face of Horizon Industries. Earnings calls, business magazines, industry conferences, company-wide announcements. Every employee knew exactly who he was. Lauren looked stunned. Robert's eyes widened noticeably. Jason appeared almost excited enough to run over immediately. "That is Daniel Mercer," someone whispered. Nobody needed confirmation. The recognition was instant. Daniel adjusted his suit jacket and exchanged a few quiet words with the people who had arrived alongside him. Then he started walking toward the backyard. Robert moved first. Lauren followed. Several employees gathered nearby. Smiles appeared. Hands prepared for introductions. Everyone assumed the same thing. They believed Daniel Mercer had come for someone standing near the center of the crowd. They were partially correct. What nobody realized was that with every step he took across the lawn, he was walking past the people expecting recognition and moving directly toward the person they had spent the entire afternoon overlooking. Daniel Mercer crossed the lawn with the calm confidence of a man who spent most of his life walking into important meetings. The difference was that this was not a conference room. It was a family reunion where nearly everyone believed they understood exactly how the world worked. Robert stepped forward first. Of course he did. His smile appeared instantly, polished and eager. "Mr. Mercer," he called out as he extended his hand. "What an honor." "Robert Hayes." Daniel acknowledged him with a polite nod, but never slowed down. The offered handshake remained hanging awkwardly in the air for a moment before Robert quietly lowered it. Confusion appeared on his face. Daniel continued walking. Lauren's smile faded slightly. Several co-workers exchanged uncertain looks. One by one, the people expecting his attention realized he was moving past them. Not around them. Past them. The entire backyard seemed to hold its breath. Daniel passed Robert. Daniel smiled. Not the public smile people saw during interviews. A genuine one. "Good afternoon, Mr. Sullivan," he said. "I hope we are not interrupting your weekend." The silence that followed felt enormous. Lauren blinked twice. Robert frowned. Several co-workers looked from Daniel to me and back again as though trying to solve a puzzle. I returned the smile and shook his hand. "Right on time," I said. "Traffic was lighter than expected," Daniel replied. Nobody understood the conversation they were hearing. Daniel's associates approached carrying folders and portfolios. Their expressions were professional, focused, routine. To them, this was simply another business appointment. Robert finally found his voice. "Mr. Mercer," he said carefully, "I think there may be some misunderstanding." Daniel turned toward him. "There is no misunderstanding." Robert forced a smile. "You know Grant." Daniel looked genuinely surprised by the question. "Of course I know Mr. Sullivan." The backyard became even quieter. Around us, nobody cared about the paperwork itself. They cared about what the paperwork implied. Robert cleared his throat. "Because it requires his approval." Robert looked as though he had forgotten how to speak. Jason's mouth opened slightly. Lauren stared at me with an expression I had never seen before. It was not anger. It was not embarrassment. It was realization. The kind that arrives all at once. The kind that changes everything. Daniel glanced between the faces around him and finally understood why nobody was talking. Then he looked back at me. "I was under the impression everyone already knew," he said. I smiled faintly. "No," I replied. They had a very different impression. For several seconds after Daniel spoke, nobody said anything. The entire backyard seemed suspended between two versions of reality. The first version was the one everyone had believed all afternoon. The second was standing directly in front of them. I watched the transition happen in real time. Robert stared at me as though he had never seen me before. Jason looked completely disoriented. Several co-workers exchanged nervous glances. Lauren remained silent. Her eyes never left my face. Daniel, to his credit, did not try to make the moment larger than it already was. He simply stood there holding the folder while years of assumptions collapsed under their own weight. "The board is waiting for your final signature," he said calmly. I nodded and reviewed the remaining documents. The paperwork itself was routine. Numbers, approvals, strategic projections. ordinary business decisions. Yet judging by the expressions around me, it looked like I was holding evidence from another planet. I signed the final page and handed the folder back. "Everything is approved," I said. "Excellent," Daniel replied. "The transition team will begin Monday morning." He shook my hand once more. "Congratulations." Then, after a brief exchange with his associates, he and the rest of the executive team began walking back toward the vehicles. Nobody rushed after them. Nobody tried to impress them anymore. The atmosphere had changed too completely. As the convoy slowly disappeared down the driveway, silence lingered behind it. The reunion was still happening technically, but it no longer felt like a celebration. It felt like a room after the lights had been turned on. Robert was the first to speak. "Grant," he said quietly, "I do not know what to say." I looked at him for a moment. "You do not have to say anything." He nodded slowly. For once, there was no speech. No lecture. No performance. Just silence. Lauren finally stepped closer. The confidence she had carried all afternoon was gone. "Why did you never tell me?" she asked. The question sounded almost identical to one she had asked years earlier about something much smaller. Back then, I had answered immediately. This time I took a moment. "Because I wanted someone to know me before they knew what I owned," I said. Her eyes dropped toward the grass. "I thought I knew you. You knew the version you decided to see." The words were not cruel. They did not need to be. Truth rarely benefits from extra volume. Around us, guests began quietly gathering their belongings. Some left without saying goodbye. Others offered awkward smiles. The laughter that had filled the yard earlier was gone. The water on my shirt had nearly dried. Funny how quickly that happened. The embarrassment lasted minutes. The lesson lasted much longer. As the sun moved lower in the sky, casting long golden shadows across the lawn, I realized something important. I did not feel victorious. I did not feel angry either. Mostly, I felt peaceful. The truth was finally standing where it belonged. Not hidden, not defended, simply present. People often imagine justice as something loud and dramatic. In my experience, it is usually quiet. It arrives without speeches, without revenge, without celebration. It simply allows people to see reality clearly. Lauren looked toward the empty driveway one final time, then back at me. "Everything changed today," she said softly. I shook my head. No, everything was already this way. Today people finally noticed. The evening breeze moved through the trees. Somewhere in the distance, a porch light flickered on. One by one, the remaining guests disappeared into their cars. The reunion was over. I picked up my keys and started walking toward the truck. Before I left, I looked back at the yard where the entire day had unfolded. The jokes, the assumptions, the laughter, the reveal. None of it seemed as important as the lesson underneath it. Never underestimate someone simply because they do not advertise their value. Sometimes the quietest person in the room understands more than everyone else combined. And sometimes the strongest response is not revenge. It is patience. Before this story ends, I would love to know what you think. If you were in Grant's position, would you have revealed the truth years earlier, or would you have stayed silent and let people show who they really were? Share your thoughts. And if stories about resilience, respect, life lessons, and unexpected truths speak to you, consider subscribing so you do not miss the next journey. Some stories end with victory. Others end with understanding. This one ended with both.